Welcome back. Today we're going to do a quick chat on the Apevoix. I'm not sure how they actually pronounce it. Apevoix? Not sure. But anyway, this one is the Grit. So actually a very nice looking shell. It's got the black carbon fiber, which is very reminiscent of perhaps the EJ07M had a very similar carbon fiber pattern with the gold flecks. So the back of it is semi smoked, so you can see through part of it but not all of it, so you can kind of, I think that's the dynamic driver there. The bone conduction I think had a vent or something around there too, but yeah, so you can see the three holes there. So yeah, maybe we can see the outline of the bone conduction plate right there. So anyway, this one is very similar. If you tap it, it does feel like it's a bone conduction. It kind of has this weird feel to it when you tap it. When you put it in your ear, you can kind of hear it, and if you tap it in your ear, then you could hear it as well. So shell's quite nice. You do get a SPC style cable, which is actually very similar to perhaps a graphene style cable. The older graphene cables looked very much like this. It was SPC with a stripe of gray material. So not sure if it is or it's just the SPC version, but yeah, it's actually a very nice looking cable. It's a little bit weighty. I was kind of surprised. I mean, when the hardware they put on it's a little chunky, and then the graphene itself is actually a little heavier weight material. So all of it combined is actually a little bit heavier than your maybe your stock standard cable. So the graph, there's not too much to say about the graph. It's actually a kind of a nicely tuned style graph. Not too much sub bass, a little mid bass, and then just kind of touching the but under the Harman curve. So nothing really too bright on this one. It's actually a very safely tuned set, and we'll kind of get into it, and perhaps we'll talk about some of the bits, some of the finer details on the graph in a minute. But so what is it? It's about a $200, and I think it's slightly above $200. Single dynamic driver, 4 balanced armatures, one bone conduction Tribrid. And I'll say that is the elephant in the room as well, is the price, right? At $200, this one is kind of pushing it. And I think to $200 and kind of what I talked about at the end of the year last year, it's becoming a barrier to entry level where you've got to be a really, really solid set to kind of break into that $200 hybrid pack. And I will say this one sounds nice and it's enjoyable. It kind of knocks on the door of those sets, but if it didn't have bone conduction, if there wasn't anything to really stand out about this particular set, it would probably be priced easily below $200. Again, I'm saying those sets that are $200 are really, really nice hybrid sets, and this one, it's nice and enjoyable is what I will say. So how is the bone conduction on this one? And I'll say, recently after hearing the KBE or KBO2, it's easier to notice the bone conduction, this particular driver, on warmer tuning. And on that particular set, I kind of talked about this. It had a nice warm, smooth, sound to it, and then the bone conduction kind of lifted it up, so the vocals kind of pushed a little bit forward. And on this one, it's not quite as warm and smooth, so you have a little bit more upper range, so the bone conduction kind of leans into the more present balanced armatures, and it's a little bit harder to notice, so it doesn't really stand out as much. I noticed more of this as this part sounds a little bit different, so some parts of track sound a little bit different. Then the bone conduction was really working in conjunction with the dynamic driver as it does on KBO2. It's not to say it's not working at all. It's just it's harder to notice it on that particular KBO2. It was more noticeable, and then on this one, kind of where you're expecting the vocals to sound a little clearer, to be more filled in. They should have been filled in already because you have 4 balanced armatures, right? So this is a difficult one. As it is a 4 balanced armature set, it already sounds separated and layered and resolving, so it's just harder to notice where the bone conduction fills in. And did they roll the treble a little bit early to hear the bone conduction? Probably. I think that was one of the reasons why they did that. And I will say it's also similar to KBO2 in that it is more sensitive to volume. It starts to step out of place and it gets a little bit less natural at more volume. And I wouldn't even call it a low volume set at all. It just tells you when it's too loud. It just starts to, especially this bone conduction bit, just starts to kind of drift a little bit higher, and things get a little bit shoutier or sharper, a little bit less natural is how I would call it. And Does this one have a little bit of a pressure buildup? Does it sound like bone conduction, dings, all those things that you're kind of expecting to have happen when you tap on it or put it in your ear? It does have some weird sounds to it that if you're not used to bone conduction, you hear a bunch of different things in that respect too. But yeah, I think there was a little bit of a pressure buildup. There's definitely when you're putting more so this set, the Grit, than KBO2. KBO2 I think had just a slightly thicker shell. This one's a little bit more noticeable when you're putting it in your ear. And the bone conduction, it's not quite driver flex, but it's kind of along those lines. Just something odd that you hear when you're putting it in your ear. So the sound in this one, kind of between the tuning and the bone conduction, it presents as a vocal hybrid, is how I'll call it. There's very much a vocal emphasis on this set. The bass and the upper treble lower just to give you that very focused, neutral-ish vocal section, and I think it's actually quite well done if that's what you're looking for. If it's not what you're looking for, it kind of fits a listener preference more so than a general purpose set. The way they tilted down the bass, and you kind of saw that on the graph. This is kind of a little bit of an arc to the sub bass, kind of brings this down, just push this up slightly to give you a little bit more body, and then push this a little bit forward, and then bring down the whole treble section, and that's gonna, the whole upper treble section kind of falls just below the vocals, and you're kind of stuck with the emphasis right there. And as a vocal focus set, I think that is a fine thing to do. The bone conduction is going to kind of fill in there as well. I think it's actually pretty well done if that's what you were going for, and it's not too bad. So the bass on this one, I think in the context of that style set of a vocal focus set, I do love the curve. I think you do drop the distracting sub bass, add a little bit of meat to the body or the vocals and the mid bass. Just really nice, very slight boost. It kind of comes across as neutral-ish. I like the speedy driver that they put into it. It has a really taut sound to it. I like it, but perhaps not for bass-led genres. In the context of a vocal focus set where you don't want the distractions of too much sub bass, too much mid bass, too much thick on the lower end, this tuning, this driver actually does a pretty nice job at doing exactly that. And on the mids, again, a few finesse touches to the mids, the small mid bass bump, slight early rise gives you the focus, and then hit ear gain a little bit later, right? So I was just kind of talking about these things. So they added just a hair kind of bump to the mid bass, just give you a little bit more body for those male vocals. Tilt this up just a little bit. That gives you just a slightly, just a bare minimum of a little bit more forward to your vocals, and then pull this back a little bit. So avoid the shout right here, and then add in kind of the energy later, and then you dip it out at 5K so nothing really rides above the vocals. Again, kind of just a few finesse points that they did on the tuning that I think were actually quite well done. And again, as a $200 set, I think they actually got a lot of the tuning bits right. Does it compete, technically with a lot of $200 sets? Probably not. But I think tuning-wise, they actually did hit, a really nice, delicate tightrope of trying to present clear vocal focus without the shout, balance the energy before and after. It's kind of exactly what I just talked about. As a 4-balanced armature hybrid, maybe not as resolving as some with the treble levels that they use. It kind of rolls a little bit early. But for vocals, it has a really nice musical unforced flow to it. Again, they did a really nice balance on this before and after, where you're expecting the shout. They really pulled that back, just to add a little bit more forwardness to it and just kind of bolster the back end with a little bit of energy. And then you dip out the treble. And, it's actually a really nice flowing set to it. By going a little bit more neutral, it will sound a little bit more natural to most people, less BA timbre, and that was another reason why to keep the volume lower. Definitely keeping the volume lower, you get less BA timbre, less of the bone conduction stepping out. The whole thing sounds a lot more natural, and again, it's kind of why I pointed out twice that the volume is going to make quite a bit of difference on this one. And then a treble, again, for a hybrid treble for sensitive listeners, I think starting right after the vocals, the 5K, again, if you look at this graph, if you just take a first glance at it, it kind of looks pretty normal, kind of what you're expecting, but the focus is pretty much right here. They dip out the 5K, so nothing is really going to rise above. A lot of those cymbals and snares that kind of hit hard at 5K, those things are dipped out, so that energy level is going to be below the vocals. And then this actually drops out a little bit early as well, so you don't have a lot of the air region, a lot of the upper treble even trying to rise above the vocals. All of this stuff is kind of really kind of rolled off and falls off in a pretty natural way. And if you just kind of glance at where 10K is, 10K is, probably a few dB underneath the mids. Again, you can kind of just get a general feel for what this graph looks like and where the upper treble region is going to be just a slightly lower version. So again, if you are a higher volume guy, you're probably not going to hear a whole lot of this. It's not going to sound as airy as you're probably thinking it does if you just take a quick look at the graph. But dropping the treble level to below the vocals, I think all this stuff is probably things that I already said to keeps anything from rising too high, continue downhill, allow some extension, and naturally fall off in treble for treble sensitivity at the expense of the air region. So like I said, it kind of rolls off in a way that's maybe a little bit early, but for you guys who are looking for something that's not so treble heavy for a hybrid, I think they actually got that style tuning done quite well. Again, really not a bad thing that they rolled it a little bit early if you're into air, unless you're into air or micro details. But this tuning, again, it really mitigates lots of BA problems. So if you take into account the normal volume with the bone conduction, the 4 BAs that are going to sound a little bit better at lower volume, and then the treble tuning, the way it's actually pulled back a little bit, all three of these things try to mitigate that BA timbre, that going off natural thing that a lot of people complain about in hybrids. So yeah, I do think that there was quite a bit of thought of mitigating that problem, and again, the treble tuning is just one of those things that does it. And on the stage, again, you can kind of guess about it. Not going to be the most stagey set with the treble set off, just kind of rolling off a little bit early. The 10K, not quite. Really even with the mids, it's just not going to project as much as you would expect in a really nice $200 hybrid set. Doesn't sound small, but it doesn't project, and that's kind of where I would leave it on Grit. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.